Hello and welcome back to my channel. My name is Albert. I'm a Boeing 747 captain, and on this video we're going to be looking at landing the Boeing 747. There's a few things we're going to be covering on this video. First one we're going to be covering is the ICAO and FAA runway markings, landing performance assessment. We're going to be covering aiming point, flight director ILS guidance to 500 feet, visual aids to use below 500 feet, the flare, landing, use of autobrakes, use of reverse thrust, and finally, what not to do. So sit back, relax, and let's get straight into it. So we're in Miami, we're on final approach for the ILS runway 9er. We're at 2,000 feet, and we are exactly 6 miles from landing. So before we look at the landing, let's just look at the ICAO and FAA runway markings, because this is very important to understand for you to make a good landing. And you'll see why after I explained it. We've got a chart up on the screen here with runway markings for the United States and for an ICAO runway. So let's start by looking at the United States runway. So you've got your threshold here, threshold markings here. We can land anything from the threshold onwards. Okay, here, these two solid lines, these are called the 1,000 feet markers or the landing markers. You'll see they start at 1,000 feet, and then the markers after that, these ones, starts at 1,500 feet. Because this is important to know, because when we talk about the aiming point, you'll understand a little bit more later. Looking at the ICAO runway, the aiming point markers starts at 1,300 feet. So the end of these markers will be 1,500 feet. Okay. And then also very, very important to note, both FA and ICAO, the end of the touchdown zone markers is at 3,000 feet. Why that's important is, so if you land on a runway and you float and you then touch down after the last touchdown zone markers, which means you've touched down after 3,000 feet, there's no way for you to know how much runway you have left. So it's a good idea then to just go around and then to try again. So that's the FAA and ICAO runway marking. So now let's look at a landing performance assessment. As you know, runway 09, conditions is dry, no wind, outside air temperature is going to be 15 degrees. Altimeter is 29902, it's going to be a flaps 30 landing, no credit to the reverses, 340 tons, calculate. So you can see the landing distance available at the moment is 11,397 on runway 9. Autobrake 1 is going to be more than that, so we cannot use Autobrake 1, we can use Autobrake 2 and 3. I would prefer to use Autobrake 3 because it gives us a 2,000 feet margin to play with in case we land after 1,500 feet on the runway. The issue I have now, as you can see, the recommended brake cooling time is in the caution range. If we select flaps 25, to give you an example, you also see max manual will be in the melt range. So we want to avoid the caution range. We want to definitely avoid the melt range. And the reason we want to do that is because when the tires gets more than 107, the brakes becomes hotter than 177 degrees Celsius. The heat will transfer to fuse plugs inside the tires. It sits on the rim of the tires, and it will then deflate the tires when these plugs melt. So the nitrogen will then slowly escape the tires. It'll deflate, and this is to prevent the tires from exploding. When this happens, it's going to be a long day. You'll have to change the tires. You have to change the brakes, etc., etc. So we want to stay out of that. So what we do is we can select flaps 30. We can give credit to all the reverses. And now you'll see we can do Autobrake 2. The recommended brake cooling time on the ground is 0 minutes or 9 minutes for Autobrake 3. So good setting will be Autobrake 3. I'll change that to our Autobrake setting. I'll zoom in there. I'll change it to Autobrake 3, and I'll pause again. While we zoomed in here on the Autobrake selector, I'll just quickly explain a few things as well. You'll see we have RTO, which is rejected takeoff. So RTO arms above 85 knots. And then when you get thrust levers to idle, to reject the takeoff, it'll then give the maximum braking. We physically cannot outbrake RTO braking. So there's no fixed deceleration rate or doesn't take into account reverse thrust. It's simply the maximum braking you can get on the 747. Then the other settings, we have 5 settings: Autobrakes 1, 2, 3, 4, and Max Auto. These are based on a fixed deceleration rate, takes reverse thrust into account. If you want to disarm them on the ground, you can gently apply brake pressure, and the selector will then go to the disarm position. If it goes to the disarm position, we'll also get an ICAO message saying auto brakes, which means we now have to manually brake this aircraft. So we've discussed the FAA and ICAO runway markers, and we've also discussed the landing performance assessment now. So now let's get into the fun stuff. As you can see, we're on the ILS Miami runway 09. We're doing manual thrust. The autothrottle has been disconnected. Flight director there means the autopilot has also been disconnected, and we are passing 1,400 feet. And have a look at the reference thrust setting. It's between 61 and 62% N1. You can see there. It's good to make a note of that, because every time there's a speed change and you need to change the attitude, if you make corrections with this on the thrust, it's a good thing to set the reference thrust setting again. It's going to make your life a lot easier when you fly the approach. So at this altitude, all that we're going to be using, we're not going to be reeling outside. We're just going to use the flight director and the /ILS guidance, as you can see there. So we'll use that. And when we get lower, we can then start looking at selecting an aiming point. And I will show you when we get below 500 feet. Okay, there we are now, 500 feet. So we'll start looking at the par piece, and we'll also start looking at our visual aiming point, which is right there. Okay, so we're going to go a little bit back so I can explain the aiming point. All right. So that's going to be our aiming point. Our aiming point for the 747 is going to be at 1,500 feet. It changes. For the 777, it's 1,200 feet. On the Airbus, they typically use 1,000 feet. So what the aiming point is, if we continue flying towards the aiming point and we don't flare, that is where our eyes will hit the runway. So that aiming point, if we're in a nice 3-degree slope and stable, which we are now, that aiming point should sit about 2/3 down our windshield. And I'll draw a line now just to explain. There we go. So it should sit about there. It should stay stationary in the windshield. Some people say aiming points, they say stationary windshield. It's not 100% true, because as the speed changes, you're going to make pitch changes. So it's going to move up and down a little bit, but generally it should stay more or less stationary there in the windshield. Okay, so we'll just keep it like that. And then we're going to stay on a nice 3-degree path. We're still using ILS Flight Director guidance at the moment, but also incorporated in our scan now is going to be that aiming point. If it's very far away and you can't see the markers, just make the aiming point be right next to the par piece, which should be about 1,000 to 1,300 feet down the runway. Okay, now you'll also notice that as we get closer, the runway will grow around the aiming point. The threshold will get bigger, the end of the runway will get bigger. As you can see there with the white lines, it's growing and growing, but the aiming point will still stay exactly where it is. It stays stationary there on the lower 2/3 part of the windshield. Let's listen to the calls.
100.
Pause it there. So that's the 50 feet call. You'll get the 50 feet call when you're over the threshold. Notice now also the PAPIS now shows 4 whites. So the PAPIS is very sensitive the closer you get to the runway. So it's important not to overreact now and push the control column forward. Just maintain your attitude. Okay. So also when you hear the 50 feet, now our eyes moves away from the aiming point and we look at the end of the runway. Then, if we're doing more than 800 feet a minute, at the moment we're doing 950, we'll start the flare at 40 feet. If we're doing less than 800 feet a minute, we can start the flare at 30 feet. So when we start the flare, we're going to move that lower 2/3 of the windshield that was on our aiming point. We're going to move that up towards the end of the runway. So typically, in a perfect flare, we're going to be moving to change the attitude by 2 or 3 degrees, and then also we will be touching down at VREF, and the flare will typically take between 4 to 8 seconds. So now let's play the video again, and then let's look at the flare itself. 50, 30. So there I started the flare, and as you can see now, that spot 2/3 down the windshield is now moving up towards the end of the runway, and then we just hold the nose there and wait for the wheels to touch. 10. Okay, there you can see there's touchdown. It was a little bit of an under flare, so I think we will be touching down just before the 1,500 feet. Just before 1,500 feet. I reckon it's probably 1,300 feet or so, the touchdown. As soon as the aircraft touchdown, speed brake will deploy, and you have to wait for the wheels to touch before you can use a reverse thrust. But I'll explain the reverse thrust a little bit later in a different, from a different angle, so you can see the controls better. Now we're gently flying the nose wheel onto the runway, and we use the rudders to keep it on the center line. So the aircraft is going to decelerate. We'll keep the auto brakes in. We'll let the auto brakes do the work. And when we get to around 60 knots, we can then apply a little bit of brake pressure. Okay, so here's an outside view of the aircraft when we touched down. As you can see, we touched down exactly there at 1,300 feet as suspected, just after the 1,000 feet markers and just before the 1,500 feet marker. Okay, now let's look at the flight controls. So there you can see the thrust levers and the speed brake. So notice now, as we start the flare, we're reducing the thrust with the aim to have idle thrust. As the wheels touch, the aircraft touchdown, speed brake deploys. The thrust reversers will first go to the idle detent or the interlock position. And there you can see now we're pulling full reverse thrust. You can see the aircraft is now decelerating. We're using the rudders to keep it onto the center line. Now we're waiting for 60 knots. So the reason we at 60 knots, we're going to go from full reverse back to the interlock position or the idle reverse thrust. We do that to prevent exhaust re-indigestion. And then at taxi speed, we're going to move from the idle thrust, the idle reverse, or the interlock position, same thing. And we'll cancel the reverse because we want to prevent foreign object damage. Also, to disarm the auto brake, we'll gently apply brake pressure. You can see there the auto brake disarms, and we also get the ICAO auto brake. Okay, let's look at a few things that we should be avoiding when landing, the don't do's. So when you're on short final approach, you correct for the increase in speed by moving back the thrust levers. Some people tend to forget to go back to the reference thrust setting because they're busy looking outside. Then that'll cause a firm landing or a short landing. So if your speed is high on final and you correct it by removing the thrust lever, when you get your speed back to the approach speed, always remember to set your reference thrust setting again so you have sufficient thrust. Other thing is, as I pointed out before, the PAPIs get very sensitive, so quite often you might see 4 reds or 4 whites on short final. Don't overreact. If you get to 4 whites, don't push the nose forward, increase the rate of descent, land hard. Just keep that attitude and accept a slightly deeper landing. And then the third thing is when you're on final approach and you make any attitude changes, make the attitude changes with reference to the PFD. Okay, so always look at your instruments when you make a pitch change, so it can be a measurable pitch change. Do not look outside and just push the notes forward, because then you don't know how many degrees of pitch you've changed, and you might go unstable by increasing your rate of descent too much. The only exception when you will look outside and make a pitch change if you are on short final and you are very low. Hope these tips help. Thanks for watching the video. See you in the next one. Have a nice day. Bye-bye.